Hello, class. We have now arrived at the book of Nahum, and so it's one of the shorter ones. It'll make up for the long one that we had with Isaiah. So let's proceed. And we see the subheading here, Nineveh's Doom. So you can already get an idea of what this prophet is prophesying about. Here's the timeline. And let me get my little marker, laser pointer. And so that he's pointing forward where 612 here, where the Assyrian capital of Nineveh is sacked. Their doom, as we saw in the subheading on the title page. That happened in 612 BC. And so Nahum prophesied before that happened, so in the year before that, all right? And so that's the timeline. Here is a map we see of where Nineveh is. Nineveh is right there. I can get it over here. There it is. And it's on the north side of the Euphrates River. And down here you see this bright one, Jerusalem. Maybe that's not the Shekinah glory. But anyway, to let you know, it's predicted that here from the Holy Land, where Nahum is, that Nineveh will be destroyed. Nahum, Judgment on Nineveh, is one of the three prophetic books in the Old Testament which focuses on the judgment of Israel's enemies. The other two are Obadiah. We saw at the very beginning of this course the judgment on Edom, the Edomites, and Habakkuk. We haven't gotten to yet, but we will shortly. Judgment on Babylon. And here we see the map. The city of Nineveh, and these are some notes from Dr. Bowman, a former professor here who's passed away but taught this course many times in the past. The Nineveh was built by Nimrod. Here's Nineveh right here. And Nimrod, we see in Genesis chapter 10, 8 through 11, built the city. It's an ancient city, built on the west bank of the Tigris River. It was a large city, as we saw when we studied the prophet Jonah. The walls were 100 feet high that surrounded it, as we saw back studying those slides. And it was so wide at the top that 3 chariots could go abreast. And it had like a bunch of towers, like 1,500 towers of watchtowers. 1,500, see, right there. And so each 200 feet high. That's quite an amazement. And so the moat was 100 feet wide, and it was 60 feet deep. So it was pretty well fortified. A flood destroyed part of the wall. We see in Nahum, it tells us in verse 8 of chapter 1, and also chapter 2, verse 6 and 8. And it tells us in 2, 6, and 8 that the Babylonians came through the breach in the wall, and that they are the ones who conquered Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians. It was also destroyed by fire. So this is all things that God predicted, the Lord predicted through Nahum would happen in the future when Nahum predicted it. Comparison between Jonah and Nahum. So let's look. Jonah predicted God to be merciful. Not predicted, but basically after going and obedient of Jonah to preach there, he showed mercy because they repented in sackcloth and ashes. This was in 760 BC. An emphasis on the the prophet Jonah, particularly in chapter 4, he was more concerned about his own comfort in the heat there and of the plant that God prepared, and than he was about the lives of the people who lived in Nineveh. He was a disobedient prophet. He tried to run away because they were the enemy. He didn't want to prophesy, and he didn't want God to be compassionate to them. But the nation repented in the days of Jonah, and so they were delivered. The great fish, deliverance from water was Jonah, of course, by the great fish. And God was merciful to Jonah, who was being disobedient. But he did convince him to carry out the task that God had for him. We look at Nahum, quite different. He's prophesying about the judgment of God on Nineveh, because now generations later, 100 years later, from 760 now to 660, another generation has appeared, and they are also evil. Rebellion, they rebelled against what God had message he had given to them against their wickedness when Jonah preached it. And so rebellion instead of repentance, and it's a condition of the people there in Nineveh in 660. There's an emphasis on the prophecy, not the prophet. Jonah was the prophet, where in Nahum it's on the prediction of judgment of the enemies and who have been opposed to God's covenant people. Here Nahum is obedient, as opposed to Jonah, who was disobedient. Here the nation is disobedient, as opposed in Jonah's day the Ninevites were obedient to the message of God. And so Jonah was delivered by water. Here we're going to see there will be destruction by water. Remember the flood and made the waters fall down and allowed the Babylonians to come in and conquer them and judge them as God predicted. And so we see a great fulfillment of the prophecy of Nahum. Who's the author? Nahum, the name means comfort. Comfort wasn't to Nineveh, it was maybe to the Jews back in the Promised Land in Jerusalem. Nahum was a Elkoshite, and he was from Elkosh. Robert says Elkosh may be Capernaum. Now, we say may, that means we don't know for sure. Kephar Nahum, city of Nahum, was the city of Nahum when was changed in Nahum's honor. He says, that's what Ryrie believes, but he said may. He didn't say so concretely. We just can't say definitely. Jerome, one of the early church fathers who lived like the 4th century AD, believed Elkosh was Galilee. In the 16th century tradition, closer to our times, 16th century AD, labeled it as El Cush in Iraq, north of Nineveh. Well, they had those thoughts. Other scholars, Elkosh was located between Jerusalem and Gaza in southern Judah. So there's no consensus here about Elkosh, where that was located, where he's from. Nahum's message against Nineveh was given to Judah, since the northern kingdom, Israel, had already been taken captive, but Israel was still there in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom. They were judged later by the Babylonians for their breaking the covenant and their idolatry, too. The date of Nahum, between 663 BC and 612 BC. I showed you the 612 on the timeline earlier. Thebes in Egypt had fallen in 661, so that gives us an idea that it had to be in this range of time when Nahum prophesied. Nahum views the fall of Nineveh in 612 as yet future, when in this book that we're reading, the prophecy. Critics date Nahum after the destruction, but these are liberal critics because they don't believe in supernatural prophetic utterances. So liberals would hold that view, but I'm not a liberal. Hopefully you're not. The conversion of Nineveh under Jonah's preaching was around 760 BC. We saw the comparison between Jonah and Nahum. Nahum ministered during the reigns of Manasseh, Ammon, and Josiah. Younger contemporaries of Nahum are Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk, those prophets. So the reigns of those kings, Manasseh, Ammon, and Josiah, they were kings. But younger contemporaries who were prophets were Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. The outline of Nahum, this is from Dr. Bowman. I kept that. He was indebted to Dr. Pentecost. He got it from him. That was his source. The prophecy of judgment, we see in chapter 1, the messenger, verse 1, the character of the judge, 2 through 8, the verdict against Nineveh, 9 through 14, and the proclamation of deliverance in 1:15. Chapter 2, we see the execution of judgment. Nineveh was warned, the invasion described, the city captured and plundered, the complete destruction of Nineveh. And then on this next slide, we see the rest of it. The vindication of the judgment in chapter 3. The first indictment, the second and third indictment against the evil people who lived in Nineveh during the times of Nahum. The permanence of the destruction and the very end. Note, in spite of the wickedness of Judah, there is not one word in Nahum against Judah. So Nahum is prophesying against the Ninevites. Again, God said he would bless those who blessed the covenant people, the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, and he would curse those who did not. And in this case, the Ninevites in the days of Nahum falls into that category of receiving God's judgment as a curse. The theme, well, I didn't mean to get that. Judah, the contemporaries of Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk will prophesy against Judah because of their sin. But here in Nahum, he's just prophesying the destruction of Nineveh. And that's the theme of it. Nineveh will be destroyed. Almost every verse describes that event, which took place in 612 BC. The Ninevites, who are Assyrians, that was the capital, it's Nineveh, converted through the preaching of Jonah more than 100 years before Nahum wrote, had not transmitted their knowledge of the true God to their children, and the people had quickly reverted to their cruel and heathen practices. So it's important to teach your children. That's a good lesson for us. They had destroyed Samaria, the Ninevites, the Assyrians, the northern kingdom, and taken them captive in 722. That's another date that I had put on the timeline. We had saw it in previous, as we studied previous prophets. And they nearly captured it in 701, when Hezekiah was the king. We studied that previously as well when we studied Isaiah. Nahum briefly describes Nineveh's wickedness in chapter 3, verse 1 and 4. He says in verse 1, 3:1, "Woe to the bloody city of Nineveh, completely full of lies and pillage. Her prey never departs." Chapter 3, verse 4 also reads, "All because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries and families by her sorcery." He's talking about idolatry and evil, demonic people they were. Some lessons from Nahum about God. He is patient, powerful, holy, and just, slow to wrath, but he will surely judge in his time. He's gracious, but at some point he will judge if there's no repentance. The Lord is slow to anger, great in power. The Lord will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. In whirlwind and storm is his way, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet. So we see that in verse 3 of chapter 1 of Nahum. God's litmus test for other nations is how they treat Israel. I got ahead of myself, didn't I? I mentioned that already. God will bless those who bless Israel, the Jews, and he will curse those who don't. We see this in Nahum. Behold, on the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace. Celebrate your feast, O Judah. Pay your vows, for never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. And so here we see in verse 15 of Nahum of chapter 1, what he's going to do to Nineveh and the capital of the Assyrians. I'm going to cut them off completely. God's chosen people have a future. That's the Jews. Chapter 2, verse 1 of Nahum. The one who scatters has come up against you. Man the fortress, watch the road. Strengthen your back, summon all your strength. And so, God's chosen future do have a future because God would use the Babylonians to conquer and go into Nineveh, the capital, and can destroy them. After that flood destroyed the wall there on the Tigris River, the Assyrians were conquered by the Babylonians, and that was a great fire. Is also recorded in Nahum. The city was destroyed, and that was the enemy of the Jews, and so that gave them a future without the Assyrians doing that to them. So that's the last slide for this book on Nahum, and so we have a short one to make up for the long one that we had, long recording of Isaiah. So I look forward to our next one. Hopefully it won't be as long as Isaiah.